Hi again, everyone. You guys know I have a hard time keeping these things under 15 minutes as it is. And this one deals with the Civil War, which I could talk about forever. So I'm going to try really hard. I have a little clock going next to me here. I'm going to try really hard to keep this under 15 minutes. This is another one of our longitude or our horizontal reviews where we're kind of looking at a period throughout the different themes of APUS history. So we start as always with national identity. And in our last period, in period 4, from the Adams-Jefferson election of 1800 through to the end of the Mexican War, we talked about the fact that American identity was being formed, but also regional identities were being formed. People were forming these regional North versus South identities. So what we see in this period is those identities don't disappear at the end of the Mexican War. They dig in, they get worse. And we see that this fracture along sectional lines between the South, between the culture of the South, the educational attainment in the South, the politics of the South, the belief in what the country was about in the South, and most importantly, the view of slavery and race relations in the South. We look at all of those topics in the North, and the differences really start outweighing anything that kept them together as Americans. And the victory by the North by 1865 in the Civil War kind of leads to this critical difference that seems kind of silly at first. When you look at the difference between the United States and these United States, it seems like there's not much of a difference. But these United States indicates that they are all still separate. The United States indicates it is one country. And that one word is a really important difference, and I think a pretty valuable way to understand the Civil War and how America was before and how America was after. So the other thing we're getting out of national identity and American identity is before the war, African Americans were not seen as Americans, right? And during the period of Reconstruction, as the right to vote was introduced, as citizenship was introduced, we saw that at least black men became citizens, and at least in definition had American identity, even if they were not fully embraced by people in both South and North. In politics and power, 1844 to 1877, other than Abraham Lincoln, this is your period of some crap presidents, right? This gets us Fillmore, it gets us Pierce, it gets us Buchanan. Every one of those guys is always in the competition for bottom 10 presidents. Generally, they succeed. You get the Compromise of 1850, and you remember the Compromise of 1850 happens as California has been admitted to the Union or is being admitted to the Union, and the question is, since the old 3630 line goes right through the middle of California, is California going to be admitted as a slave state or a free state? And the agreement they come to is California comes in as a free state. But, and this is the big but, what does the South, what do the pro-slavery people get out of this? They get the Fugitive Slave Act, which says that now it's a federal crime for anybody to help an enslaved person escape their slavery. They also get popular sovereignty out of this. The idea that in the future, when a state is admitted to the Union, we'll just let people vote on whether it's going to be slave or free. And given that the only people who can vote at this point are white men, there's a better than average chance people are going to vote for slavery in a lot of these places. So it was really a deal with the devil. You have the emergence of the Republican Party in the 1850s, and the Republican Party, an incredible force for good at its creation. It's created around the idea that slavery is wrong and a strong national government needs to stamp it down. So they run a guy in 1856 for president, he loses. They run another guy in 1860, and he wins, and it's Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln's biggest, the the biggest thing Lincoln believes in is not necessarily anti-slavery. You guys, if you remember, we talked about Lincoln's first inaugural. We talked about the things that he said, and Lincoln says, if I believed this one nation could exist entirely slave, I would allow that to happen. Lincoln's biggest thing that he believes in, the biggest thing Republicans believe in, is this idea that this is one country, not a collection of little fiefdoms. And the issue that motivates them throughout all this is slavery, which a vast majority of Republicans believe is completely immoral. So the Republican Party wins the presidency. Then, as the South decides that's our ticket out, and all these southern states reject the Republican Party and declare secession, the Republicans obviously are going to have a majority in the House and Senate then too. And it's really the beginning of this new party system between Democrats and Republicans, with the Democrats having their base of support in the South and the Republicans having their base of support in the North. After the war, you're going to have 3 amendments passed, 13, 14, and 15. Remember that the 13th ends slavery and involuntary servitude. The 14th guarantees equal protection under the law and citizenship for African American people. And the 15th Amendment gives black men the right to vote, but not women. Work, technology, and exchange. For the South, this is going to be the biggest change in work in the history of their part of the country. The end of slavery in 1865 is an absolute death knell for the Southern economy as it had existed previously. They were built on a system that required forced labor, and now they have to figure out how they're going to do that. So they come up with that sharecropping system that we talked about in class. And you remember sharecropping, you are on this land that's quote unquote your land, but you have to buy the seeds from the landowner, the person that you're theoretically purchasing or leasing the land from. You have to pay that. You have to pay your seeds. You have to pay for your tools. In some cases, you have to pay for your food. And the sharecropping system, in so many ways, was slavery under a new name. Now, the majority of sharecroppers are going to be African American, but there are white sharecroppers too, and they are all equally poor under this system. Now, that's what the South is doing. They've basically decided to go back to the future. They're going to do the same thing now under a different name. They are not going to modernize their economy down there. Why should we? We'll just keep doing what we've been doing. In the North, however, it's a totally different ballgame. The Civil War really establishes the industrial North, right? Because during the war in the North, all the factories that existed are going to stop making wagons for farms and start making wagons for the army. They're going to make rifles. They're going to make cannonballs. You're going to have iron plants and steel plants. You're going to have all of these new businesses and industrial businesses that crop up because of the Civil War, and they're not going away after the war. They're going to turn their powers and talents towards consumer goods and industrializing the rest of the North. So when we look at Toledo, the Civil War is really when Toledo is going to start becoming Toledo in the wake of the Civil War, because we're going to have some businesses that are important to the war effort, and it's going to expand. Industry begets industry. If you have wagon companies in your town, as Toledo did, the Milburn Wagon Works, then you're also going to have companies that specialize in making the wheels for those wagons, like Gendron, that's going to come about. So you're going to have major factories, and then you're going to have smaller factories that are going to serve those larger factories. And so industrialization is really going to have a snowballing effect here. Railroads start crossing the country. Remember, railroads initially are purely a northern invention, but then they're going to spread west, and they're going to spread into the south, and railroads are going to crisscross the country and bring it together even more. In culture and society, pre-war, and you guys remember, we spent a lot of time on this. Remember the ideological and religious defenses of slavery? Remember when we read the stuff from the Alexander Stephens, the Confederate vice president, and we read stuff from one of the senators from the Deep South. about how they believed not only is slavery moral, the Bible calls us to enslave other people and take care of them as our slaves, which is, first of all, let's be clear, patently absurd. But then you also have the same religious documents, the same cultural documents being used by abolitionists to say it's absolutely against everything we believe in. You had millennial religious movements, not millennials, but the millennium that was coming up in 1900. You had these religious movements believing that the end of the world was near, and those millennialist religious movements are going to have a profound effect as people in certain parts of the country are going to start believing that all of this technology, all this progress is part of the end times. You have the nativist movements really crop up in the 1840s and 1850s as you have increased immigration from Catholic parts of Europe. And this nativist streak, obviously, it starts in the 1840s and 50s, and it keeps on steamrolling right through to this day with just a pure hatred of immigrants. Where are those immigrants coming from? Well, at the beginning of this period, they're coming mostly from Ireland and Germany, right? You've got the potato famine that's a push factor out of Ireland. You've got wars and a lack of land that are push factors out of Germany. And so a lot of these early immigrants are coming out of these two countries that are very, very Catholic countries, and in the case of Germany, a very Lutheran country. And these immigrants are coming in, and they're going to face terrible discrimination from the folks who have been here 5 minutes longer than them. The movement westward continues, especially after the discovery of gold in California, and then later the precious metals that are going to be found in Montana, Colorado, Nevada, etc. And that's going to drive the manifest destiny that we talked about in the last unit. Sorry for the birds being noisy behind me. I record these things outside so I don't annoy the rest of my family, and the birds are not cooperating with me today. You have the Indian Wars and reservations. We said in the last unit, Native Americans had been forced west in that period up to the end of the Mexican War, and now we've got these Indian Wars, especially after the Civil War, that are wars of annihilation against the Indian nations. We're forcing them onto reservations. You're going to have things like the Dawes Act. You're going to have all kinds of different Indian wars. So you've got the Seminole Wars down in the south, and then you've got the wars against the Plains Indians and the wars against the Indians of the Southwest, the Apache, and so on and so forth, that are all happening in this period directly after the Civil War. The gold rush in California is a huge driver of geography here. It's a huge driver of the migration and settlement that we just talked about. You also have an increasingly large population in the north. The immigrants from Ireland and Germany at first, and then later at the end of this period, when we think about the immigrants that are going to be coming from Italy, Poland, Russia, Eastern Europe, etc. When we think about those immigrants, you're not going down to work as sharecroppers because you're coming over here to get away from that stuff. They're all working in the north, so the north is really shaped by the immigrant population way more than the south is. And they're building up that huge population in the north. The other thing is, when we think about the states that fed the country, like Iowa and Missouri and Illinois and Indiana and Ohio, the breadbasket of America, these states that grew the crops helped win the Civil War. Not even part of, you could say the most important reason that the North wins the Civil War is that we could make more food and make more stuff than the South could. Remember, the South was growing cotton, and the last time I checked, you're not eating a lot of cotton. They couldn't feed themselves, they couldn't make stuff, and that's why they lose. And that's conversely why the North wins, but it's also conversely why the North is well prepared for a good economy after the war, and the South is exceptionally poorly prepared for a good economy after the war. When we look at America and the world, there is no America in the world at this point. We are not real worried about what's happening in other countries because the only thing we're worried about is keeping our country together during this point. So we are basically isolationist. We got a little freaked out when the French tried to take over Mexico, but honestly, we're not doing a whole lot about it because we're completely focused on all the troubles we have within the country at this point, especially once we realize the fear in the beginning was that the British might take the southern side, and when they didn't, it's like, okay, don't have to worry about that. We're done. So that's it. Folks, I hope this was somewhat useful for you, somewhat entertaining. Thanks for sticking with me. I barely kept it 15 minutes. Take care. Bye.